So we're going to read something about the book by Kris McDaniel, The Fragmentation of Being. Yeah, so, yeah. And in Full Studies by Maddie Eklund. Apologize how I say everyone's names. Who cares if we're not fully real? Comments on Kris McDaniel's The Fragmentation of Being. Alright, so as always, ask questions, let me know. But yeah, if you need me to try to explain Heidegger, I will try to explain some Heidegger. If you need me to try to explain anything else, I will also try to explain anything else. That does not mean I will do any sort of good job. Yeah, so... But yeah, this is why I want to read this. So it's like nihilism, we got modes of being, existence. I like how Kris McDaniel is his own keyword. I wonder if people actually search Kris McDaniel as keyword. But anywho, alright, here we go. Most of Kris McDaniel's The Fragmentation of Being is devoted to laying out and defending a metaphysical framework where one can, in a theoretically significant way, distinguish between different modes of being, and where one can distinguish between what exists to the fullest extent and what does not. And we've got this to the fullest extent in italics. I have no idea what that means. To exist to the fullest extent and to not exist to the fullest extent. I mean, maybe this is some sort of authenticity claim. And for those who don't know their Heidegger, authenticity is sort of one of these things that Heidegger harped on, like what it is to be your true self, to be authentic or whatever, and it got a lot of play in other disciplines. And you hear it all the time in media saying, "Oh, that person's fake." Well, that's coming out of this tradition here. Connecting these two elements, McDaniel holds that the degree of being enjoyed by some entity is proportionate to the naturalness of the most natural mode of being enjoyed by that entity. Yeah, so this really looks like some sort of how true you are to your true self, like the naturalness to the most natural mode. So the most natural mode seems like a authenticity claim, and how close you are to that authentic self. Alright, some modes of being are fundamental, and some things have a fundamental mode of being. At the other extreme, some things are mere beings by courtesy. They exist but do not have any fundamental mode of being. So it sounds like a conventional existence. I don't know what that really is, to be by courtesy. Like, is this, like it's a thing that being is like by etiquette? I wonder what that is. Like, a greeting is like important, but only in like etiquette. Otherwise, like, why are you doing it? Well, that's interesting too. I haven't thought of like existence by etiquette. Alright, it is a wonderful book. It is full of interesting ideas, and the key ideas are carefully developed, and McDaniel traces many significant connections both to contemporary and to historical discussions. However, I will here focus on some issues where I am in disagreement with McDaniel's. Cinesemiotics, what's up? How you doing? To talk about Nazism vis-a-vis Heidegger, I mean, just put your position on record and educate the audience. Well, everyone knows he was a shitty person. He was, well, in terms of being a Nazi, he was a Nazi, and it was shitty. And I mean, you have to kind of separate out the metaphysics from the Nazism, because he was a Nazi, and yeah, and he was a Nazi. The Germans keep good records, and Heidegger paid his Nazi dues up until 2 months before the end of the war. Yeah. It's fair, Falpo. It is Heidegger. You get to italicize things. So if you can't separate the Nazism from Heidegger, and I know some people can't, they have moved away from Heidegger on that, just because of that. Like, that's fair. I, however, like, I'm just gonna, take what I can from Heidegger and understand that there's no ethics in Heidegger. Like, there's none. That's one of the things about his metaphysics you might criticize, just because there's no ethics there. Nothing. So, if you think that might be actually a reductio ad absurdum, that you can't find any way to put ethics into your metaphysics, then maybe like that is a problem for Heidegger. Otherwise, if you just like your abstract metaphysics, it's very interesting abstract metaphysics. Yeah, that's a good point. It's always good to mention it. Although I do sometimes feel like a broken record, that like everyone always mentions it, but like, yeah, but people do fall in love with Heidegger, and then they end up trying to defend the man when it's there's no defending his there's no defending his Nazism. Basically, a few years back, more than a few at this point, but like some more notebooks of his came out. Okay, puns. Yeah, like a few years back, some more of his notebooks came out, and it was like, oh wow, he was really a big Nazi back in the time. And people were like, some people like, they were like, oh my God, we didn't think so. But then like everyone who knew was like, yeah, of course he was. Everyone should have known that already. I mean, you don't have to harp on it, but like you should have known if you were interested in Heidegger. But like, it's like, all right, it's like, why are you beating the dead horse? Mention. I'm in a chat where basically if you make bad puns, you get timed out. And so the worse pun you make, you get timed out for longer. So I have the honor of being a 5-minute timeout as opposed to just like a 1-minute timeout or like a 1-second timeout. So I made a very bad pun once. And I was very proud of myself. Yeah. Yeah, there's actually, he's worth shouting out. The Daniel Matt is a streamer. He's one of these old school streamers, actually, from like, he got partnered like 8 years ago or something, then he stopped for a while. But he's actually a professional writer. He's an author. He's Swiss, and he's been streaming daily or almost daily. He gets like, 6-hour streams, 8-hour streams. But like, basically he streams extremely slowly playing video games, and he sits there and he talks about the game. Like, so you play a game where you can read stuff, you'll sit there. Like, he was playing Returnal, which is a great game apparently, but like at some point you're looking at a bookshelf in the game, and he was literally reading all the titles of the fictional books on the bookshelf. So he spent, like, this is an action shooter game, and with narrative elements, and there's a bookshelf in one of the parts, and he literally will spend an hour looking at the bookshelf and like discussing why the books are there. So, but he's an interesting guy. So he's like I said, he's a published author, and so if you want to go and you want to sit around and like talk about shit, and like with extremely just like slow gameplay, him looking at all the things and discussing why did they do this, what was this decision, you can go check out the Daniel Matt. And so if you are in that stream, you can get timed out for bad puns. Or good puns, actually, yeah. If it's a bad pun, you get a quick timeout. If it's a very excellent pun, it's a longer timeout, but that's a badge of honor. So, yeah. So, okay. So we're going to disagree with McDaniel. We wonder how. Okay, in one chapter of the book, and just so you know, my alerts are still down. So if anyone, like, does anything alertsy, it'll the fact. Thank you, Cinesemiotics. Yeah, my alerts are still broken, and I don't know when they're gonna get fixed because things are just bad with some of my software at this point, and it's unfortunate. So you don't update sometimes. Okay, in one chapter of the book, the one these remarks will focus on, McDaniel turns to the question of what mode of being we have. We are persons. Do persons exist to the fullest extent, or are we mere beings by courtesy? As McDaniel makes clear early in the chapter, he thinks these questions matter evaluatively. He thinks a natural and reasonable evaluative conception of ourselves, one which cannot be lightly surrendered, requires that we do exist to the fullest extent. In a striking passage, he says, "We take ourselves to be beings that matter. We are persons, and persons count. Among other things, this implies that persons are to be counted. If we are beings by courtesy or a more objective ontological scheme would not countenance us. Fundamentally, we would not be counted. We would not count." Okay, so if we're somehow, I think this courtesy is sort of a conventional thing. And if you're talking objectively, if you're just a convention, then you don't count. But McDaniel holds that we matter, and therefore you have to have a metaphysics that thinks we matter, and that would count us not as just conventions. As McDaniel notes, this reasoning may seem to equivocate on counting, but he goes on to give more proper arguments for the conclusion that, as he puts it here, we do not matter. The arguments are to the effect that there is a certain link, hence for the link, between, on the one hand, the questions of metaphysics that McDaniel discusses concerning different degrees of being, and on the other hand, mattering. Specifically, mattering requires a certain degree of being. I am skeptical of McDaniel's arguments that the link obtains, and I am skeptical of the idea that the link skeptical of the arguments that the link obtains, and skeptical of the idea that the link obtains. So even the idea of it, this author is questioning over and above what McDaniel has to say about it. I have to say, I'm not loving the writing here. I'm stumbling over a lot of the words, but we'll find out how this is going. Okay, having argued for the link, McDaniel turns to, in the rest of the chapter, considering what arguments can be marshaled for the full reality of persons. Yeah, so this is what I thought you'd want to do. You want to say that people are the sort of things that matter. I mean, this is, as Valpo mentioned, and Semiotics also mentioned, this is a Heideggerian thing, and, you know, you want to talk about being, Dasein, and what is the being of people. Like, this is what, you know, there's being, like, the universe, and then, like, our being. What is our being? Well, Dasein, that we have to deal with. And so this is what our full reality is. So again, authentic people, what is it to be authentically human? He considers ideas from McTaggart and from Heidegger, and at some more length, arguments relying on the principle that only fully real entities can enjoy perfectly natural properties and relations. Given this latter principle, one can show that persons are fully real by showing that persons enjoy some such properties and relations. The question is, which properties and relations might these be? McDaniel considers shape properties and spatial relations, causation and causal powers, the property of having qualia, and generally having certain emergent mental properties which can be thought to be perfectly natural. He spends the most time on the last suggestion, which seems the most promising. So having the property of having qualia, or emergent mental properties, I don't know which one it is. One question is whether the property of having qualia is indeed perfectly natural. Another is whether it is persons who instantiate the qualia. It may seem that the answer to the latter question is obviously yes, but another possibility is that four-dimensionalism is true, and qualia are had by person stages, and persons are then sums of person stages. Okay, so in other words, people exist in some sort of four-dimensional space-time, and then we exist where the qualia is? Is that what it is? Okay. Having examined this at some length, McDaniel turns to the possibility of appealing to hexaeistic properties, like the property of being Kris McDaniel. So hexaeistic means being the property of being a specific thing. So like the property of being Kris McDaniel. If all you out there have a very specific property of being your exact self at your exact moment, and that would be a hexaeistic property. And so if you have the property of being your exact self at that exact moment, then that'd be a very unique property and be something kind of natural. Toward the end of the chapter, McDaniel turns to what he calls practical arguments for full reality, where a practical argument for P, in McDaniel's words, has a premise that the truth of P is a necessary condition for an aspect of our normative practice to make sense. McDaniel considers different practical arguments and notes their seeming limitations. This paper is structured as follows. In section 2, I discuss McDaniel's argument for the link, or in his words, for the claim that we matter only if we are fully real. In section 3, I distinguish between some different things McDaniel might mean when he says that we do not matter. Section 4 discusses some other possible arguments for the link. Section 5, in a different way, addresses the connections between metaphysical and normative matters, discussing an argument against reductive naturalism presented by McDaniel. Section 6 focuses on the question of whether even our existence, let alone our full existence, is needed for us to matter in the relevant sense, and brings up the relevance of this to what McDaniel focuses on. As may be evident from this summary, there is no linear progression between the sections. They are only united by a common theme. What is the connection between metaphysical and normative matters? Okay, so this is interesting. This is a sort of a thrown together paper. Yeah, I don't know. This is very odd. So they're just saying, going to discuss random things put together and what actually is it to be an authentic human and why does that matter? And they're just going to pick some stuff out of McDaniel to talk about this. which is interesting. Not saying it isn't. I'm just saying it's unusual for a philosophy paper. Where did I say this was like from? This is from Philosophical Studies. Interesting. Usually you get very, very structured things in like these stodgy journals, but okay. McDaniel's argument. In this section, I will assess McDaniel's argument for the link. McDaniel makes use of a Brentano-style account of intrinsic value, where the notion of correctness plays a central role. To illustrate the idea, McDaniel mentions the following Brentanian account of intrinsic goodness and intrinsic badness. Something is intrinsically good if and only if an act of love that takes the thing as its object is correct. Something is intrinsically bad if and only if an act of hate that takes that thing as its object is correct. As stated, accounts like these may seem to lie open to immediate counterexamples. If someone threatening to do something awful to Jones's family unless Jones performs an act of love or hate towards something X, which intuitively is not intrinsically deserving of that love or hate, then Jones's performing that act of love towards X is intuitively correct. But as properly understood, these accounts are not vulnerable to such counterexamples. To defend the account as stated against such apparent counterexamples, one must either rely on a technical notion of correctness, so even if Jones ought to love X under the circumstances, this love is incorrect, or include an intrinsicness condition also on the right-hand side. In the literature, fitting is often used instead of correct. Given this alternative formulation, the counterexample arguably lose what intuitive force they have. The examples just show that sometimes one ought, all things considered, to have a certain attitude, even if that attitude is not fitting or, in the relevant sense, correct. Alright, this is weird already. Now we're going to start to say you should love it and like only in the right sort of correct love, which is a very idealistic thing. You have to remember, Heidegger's an idealist, comes out of the idealistic tradition. And so you can just sort of define yourself into being in the correct state of the world, which is weird sometimes, because how do you actually know what it is to be correct or fitting? Like, why should like your love fit certain things or versus not? And you can say, well, conceptually it does, but that's the idealistic sort of conceit that you can just sort of imagine yourself being in the correct sort of loving relationship. Can you? I don't know. Like, is that always going to be right? People make mistakes about that stuff. The Brentanian framework itself can, of course, be criticized, but I think that even taking this general framework for granted, there are natural ways to resist McDaniel's arguments. McDaniel focuses on the attitude of attending to and discusses what it is correct to attend to. If it is correct to attend to only what is real, then if persons are not real, it is not correct to attend to persons. McDaniel's suggested view is that there is one object-directed attitude that is maximally correct if and only if its object is fully real, the attitude of attending to. I mean, that's kind of the definition of object-directed attitude, is what it is to be the attitude of attending to. But alright. McDaniel says that given this view, if we are merely beings by courtesy, then we are not ourselves fit objects for our thoughts. And the thought appears to be, if we are not fit objects for ourselves to attend to, then we are not fit objects for any thoughts, and hence we are not fit objects for us to love or care about. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. If we're like worrying about some convention, and now, of course, worrying about some conventions has its time and place, but in the grand scheme of things, if it's just a convention, it's going to go away eventually, then you can't really worry about it. But us, on the other hand, the idea is that if we have actual being, then we're not just going to go away, or we can't go away in like the way a convention does. Okay. However, speaking of what is correct to attend to, simpliciter is somewhat artificial, if not downright odd. Yeah, it kind of begs the question, of course. Like, why should, like, paying attention to something is what matters? You're assuming so. It is much more natural to consider what is correct to attend to for a given purpose. That's what I was just saying, like, purpose. You have to, why are you looking at something? Something, like when I was saying, in convention, there's reasons to attend to conventions, but, like, you know, they don't last. They only have conventional value. Some things may be correct to attend to for the purpose of limiting the metaphysical structure of reality. Other things may be correct to attend to for other purposes, like various evaluative or normative ones, such as questions about how to act. And attention for such purposes seems to be the most relevant to loving and caring. Maybe insofar as questions about what it is correct to attend to simpliciter makes sense, such questions are best thought of as most similar to questions of the first of the two kinds, distinguish the ones about the metaphysical structure of reality. Radical Disability, what's up? How you doing? Hey Nogre, how's it going? It's rough online fighting ableism. My mind is literally mush because I have to figure every tactic people can use the things to oppress. Yeah, ableism is a tough thing to argue against because I know I make mistakes about ableism. It's just, if you have not considered it very, very seriously, you are going to make like ableist mistakes. Like, it's just going to happen. And it's a fight. I know when you have these troubles, it's always gonna keep you down because it's like you hear people hear stuff out of like minority studies. It's like they don't have to respond to all the jackasses out there like crapping on their minority, because that's putting all the responsibility on them. It is not the responsibility of the minority to fix all the assholes out there. And it's really hard because there's more assholes than there are people that have time and effort to fight. So yeah. But yeah, I appreciate mine being mush, and I know how hard, I don't know how hard your struggle is, but I appreciate that it is a hard struggle. So yeah, sorry you got troubles, but like, it's how it goes. If there's anything you want to ask about, let me know. But I know very little about disability studies in general, or even not even like abilities, or what are they? I don't even know what it's called right now. But yeah. So yeah. Ableism is tough. It is. This is again, like, I don't do the social, I don't do the political stuff enough to really speak too much about it. Things to learn. But anyway, yeah. So let me know. Yeah, if you have questions about philosophical tactics, however, I do know a lot about those. So let me know. Okay. Back to metaphysics, though. Another thing I know a little bit more about, though. It is fully consistent with this that there are things such that, although it is not correct to attend to them simpliciter, it is correct to attend to them for such and such specific purposes. Yeah, if you have a conventional thing, you can look at it for that time, and it matters for that time. Because, society's full of conventions, as Radical Disability has pointed out. Some of them suck, but you have to pay attention to them insofar as they suck and they need correction. Maybe once they're gone, though, there's no need to attend to them anymore. But for the purpose of calling out someone's bullshit, then it does really make a difference sometimes. So you have to attend to them for the purpose of calling out bullshit, but as soon as the bullshit's gone, it's gone, and you don't have to worry about it no more. It's because it wasn't real. What was it? It wasn't a natural kind. Like, people's idiocy is not people's idiocy is a natural kind. The particular bigotry people have is not a natural kind at any given point. Because as soon as it's gone, you never have to think about it again. And you don't have to attend to it. So that's a nice example, actually. Bigotry, specific instances of bigotry, there is no reason to ever think about them if they, once they're in the past. You can just move on from them. Unless you're, of course, trying to prevent future stuff. But the old ones you don't have to worry about anymore. In order for the point about attention to carry the weight it would need to in order to support McDaniel's argument, it would need to follow from it that for any attitude one can adopt towards an object which in fact requires attending to the object, it is only correct to adopt this attitude towards fully real objects. I do not see how this further claim could follow. As noted earlier, McDaniel puts the upshot of his arguments in terms of mattering. Even if we are not fit objects for attention, we could matter in a quite natural sense, for we could be fit objects of love and care, and we can be such that our interests ought to be taken into account. Yeah, so it's like, again, even if some, like, say you don't really think animals, like you don't really care about animals or whatever, but you don't want animals to suffer because you don't want extra suffering in the world, but you don't actually care about, like, you know, animals or something. So it's like animals deserve the love and care, but like in the grand scheme of things, you don't need a pet. So it's like you don't actually need to attend to them, but you can also recognize that some people like their pets. And so it's like you may not care about having a pet, but like that doesn't mean you don't recognize that. And given that people do enjoy having their pets and are fit objects of love and care, you can appreciate that even if you don't think, you know, having a pet is for you. And so it may only be like a matter of courtesy that people get pets, like that they like it, but it's like it's not a grand, nothing in your grand scheme of the world. So, but like that doesn't make sense. Like, does that mean the pets that people have are not fit objects of love or care? That doesn't follow, because obviously people love their pets. Okay, McDaniel also makes what on the face of it is a different suggestion, saying one might hold that any sub-act of a propositional attitude that has content is correct to the extent that the object of that act is fully real. He does not attempt to argue in favor of the seemingly separate claim, and I don't find it immediately plausible. Moreover, even if the suggestion is correct, a version of a point I made above is relevant. Call a sub-act of the type of the relevant type S. As before, even if S is not correct in the sense of fitting, when its object is not fully real, it can be that an agent sometimes ought to perform an act of type S, whose object is not fully real. Maybe a moral agent ought sometimes to have propositional attitudes whose contents are about something not fully real. A necessary means to that is for her to perform an act S whose object is less than fully real. Indeed, maybe we are fit objects for love and care, even if the acts of loving and caring require sub acts which are not fitting. All right, this is weird. It's true. Why would you say that like a sub act of a propositional attitude that has content? Again, like, why couldn't you have the sub act? I mean, what's the content here that matters? Is it the conventional content, or is this the objective content that of a natural kind? And so again, it looks like you can have a sub act, like if you do something for your pet, again, that is not like directly related to the pet, but like it's some sort of sub act, then that matters like in relation to the pet. But again, the pet may not be objectively real under this account because it's not a person. If like that you're somehow making a distinction between people and animals. Not saying that's what you should be doing. I'm just saying that people do make distinctions between people and animals, and so a sub-act for the pet would still matter under the conventional mattering of that pet. I'm starting to think that this might also be running back to the Frege for those people who know it. It is called saturated objects. I mean, this is getting into the Frege a little bit more than I'm sure anybody really wants to, but like if you're thinking about what actually is has an idea with content, there was saturated and unsaturated concepts, and from the Frege. So a saturated concept had an actual thing out in the world. So it was objective. It was an extensional. This was Frege's notion of. If I'm wrong about this, someone tell me. It had to do with extensionality of the object. And so if there was an unsaturated object, that means you could kind of have a concept of it, but it wasn't actually out in the world. It wasn't fully real. And so this would I'm thinking this is actually maybe borrowing off the philosophy of language here and mathematics, where you have like these concepts, these unsaturated ideas, but like this is just you've made up an idea out of nothing, like an arbitrary abstract thought. There's nothing out in the world about it. But if that thought actually had something about the world, then the derivable sub thoughts off of that, those also sort of inherit the saturation because there is an object there. But yeah, that's the only reason I think of bringing this sort of thing up. But that's okay. Okay, at one point, having mentioned how for medieval philosophers, metaphysical and evaluative issues go hand in hand, McDaniel mentions that the idea that the direction of our cognition should be towards the fundamental still informs contemporary metaphysics. He quotes Ted Sider to illustrate. Structure has an evaluative component. The goal of inquiry is not merely to believe many true propositions and few false ones. It is to discern the structure of the world. An ideal inquirer must think of the world in terms of its distinguished structure. She must carve the world as joints in her thinking and language. Employers of worse languages are worse inquirers. But in connection, that's end quote. But in connection with themes I've already brought up, note that Sider speaks specifically of the goals of inquiry and of ideal and worse inquirers. And one can well hold that what goes for me qua inquirer is different from what goes for me qua moral thinker. Maybe thinking in terms of, say, my children makes me a worse inquirer if my children are not fully real in the sense McDaniel characterizes, but not thinking in terms of my children still makes me a worse parent and moral agent. Yeah, so again, what's the structure here? Why are we thinking about the world or what matters? Yes, of course you're thinking about the world and what matters in the world, but like, what's that actually doing for McDaniel? It's like, yeah, you should be thinking about the objects that are fully real in some sense, like the authentic things in the world. That's what you should be thinking about. But again, how do you get there is the question. How do you actually get at the things in the world? And sometimes you're going to have to be thinking about other things also, and that's how you get your stepping stone from you love Qua. What's funny about this, they didn't italicize qua right here because it would screw with the rest of the paragraph, even though quite often you italicize the Latin here. But there's so much other italicized words that the qua might screw it up, which is actually kind of funny here. But yeah, again, how do you get at things in the world? You need stepping stones. And so, like, cinesemiotics does philosophy of film. Are the films something in the world, or are they just conventions? Thank you, cinesemiotics. Yes, but it's like, yes, films are conventions. These are like works of art we make. Are they in some sense real? Well, what the things we show in them are real, but again, you have to do the work of cinematography to get at those things, and that matters. And so it's like, you're asking, like, well, what else matters? That you have to talk about the way we get to them, and that's kind of this courtesy thing here, like, or courtesy or convention. You have to talk about that, and that matters too, because in some sense it's prioritizing the wrong thing if you only think that the object of the idea is the only thing in the world, because there's other things going on, like there's the method of presentation that matters too, but it's just a different object. And so these things you might consider actually only relative, and then that kind of breaks McDaniel's argument if things are relative, not necessarily one is the real and the other is the courtesy or convention. Kinds of mattering 3. Yeah, if anyone has any questions about the metaphysics, let me know. I know metaphysics is not for everyone. Kinds of mattering. McDaniel says that if we are merely beings by courtesy, and I'm using convention here because I don't actually understand what courtesy means in this stuff. If we are conventional beings, then we are not beings that matter. It may be worth distinguishing between two kinds of theses in this general vicinity. It may be natural to think that if we do not matter, then our pleasures and pains, and the satisfaction of our desires, etc., do not matter. But that does not immediately follow. The pleasures and pains that may matter, even if their subjects do not. And this is what I was saying about dogs before. You don't want to wish your pets pain, but the dog itself may not matter in some sense if you don't think anyone other than humans matter. And I'm not saying that's a good idea, but you have to, if you're making a distinction between people and animals, then maybe, like, say, like, or even plants. Like, plants can maybe experience kinds of pain too, but it's like you still make a distinguish, but you still distinguish between people and plants. Okay, one kind of view on which we are not beings that matter is a view on which our pleasures and pains, our plans and projects, the things we feel and have, and the things we do still matter. The pains, pleasures, plans, and project we have normative significance just like we naturally think they do. It is only that it is not important who is the subject of these things. Compare Parfit's famous view that personal identity does not matter. Parfit does not question that specific things we care about matter. What fails to matter on Parfit's view is only who feels the pleasures and pains, whose plans are realized, etc. Yes, I guess if you had some idea that, like, if you're part of a big project, you matter, but otherwise you don't. So you have to be part of, like, humanity's destiny or something, then you matter. But, like, other than, like, being part of something bigger, then you don't. Like, you hear that around sometimes. Like, that's how people say, I feel I matter, is by being part of something bigger than themselves. On a different kind of view, if we are not beings that matter, then by the same token, our pains, pleasures, plans, and projects do not matter either. Not only is it not important who is the subject of various experiences, etc., but the pains, the pleasures, pains, etc., do not matter in themselves either. No doubt more can be said to distinguish the two views outlined, but I hope this brief characterization suffices for present purposes. To have names for the views, let me call the former the Parfidian view and the latter the nihilist view. It should be clear that the nihilist view threatens to be more radical than the Parfidian view. If it only is the Parfidian view which is correct, then what we do and feel generally matters as before. It is only that tracing who does it and feels it turns out to be of no significance. I don't think McDaniel's is explicit regarding what sort of view he has in mind, but he does mention Buddhists and Hume as thinkers who have accepted the view on persons he describes, and these thinkers have arguably only accepted the Parfidian view. And he does think that the full reality of states of affairs in which we partake is not sufficient for us to matter in the requisite way. So maybe it is only the Parfidian view he has in mind. Is the Parfidian view a stable resting place in the sense that if we are only beings by courtesy, that view and not the more radical view is the upshot? I take it that by McDaniel's own lights, the Parfidian view is a stable resting place only if the pleasures and pains themselves, or the satisfaction of our preferences, or whatever are the specific things we take to matter, exist to some appropriate degree. McDaniel does outline an argument for why qualia are perfectly natural. They would then satisfy a necessary condition for mattering. But such an argument would immediately yield only that qualia, maybe pleasures and pains under certain conceptions of what pleasures and pains are, satisfy a necessary condition for mattering. It would not help show, for example, that preference satisfaction matters. My doubts regarding McDaniel's reasoning discussed in the previous section apply regardless of which view he has in mind. I do not think that his arguments establish even a Parfidian view. Specifically, evaluative attitudes towards people, for example, loving and caring, may be perfectly in order even if we are not fully real. Yeah, so I guess if you want to say, look, loving and caring is what matters in this world, and it's not the people, just because we are the things that do the loving and caring does not mean we are granted the mattering status. We may not matter. It may only be that the loving caring does. Why should we have the reflected glory of being the things that love and care when only the love and care matter? And I guess that was not argued for, and how would one argue for that? I don't know. But like, it's a strange metaphysics, as I was saying. Okay. Yeah, I wonder if there's I don't know if there's a whole lot more to say about that, but it's kind of interesting, like what matters, and if it's not people directly but some other part of us, we should not get the reflected metaphysical glory of being. But yeah, it's like, how do you actually shift value from an object to the object that holds it, or the object that performs the act? It's a hard question if you say only the act matters and not the person or the agent. Wholes, fictional characters, and us. Above, I criticized McDaniel's argument for the link. But one may think that even if those arguments fail, surely there are reasons to believe the link. McDaniel might simply appeal to examples. He might, for example, say that if we are merely beings by courtesy, then we have the same ontological status as wholes and fictional characters. To mention some examples of being by courtesy, which McDaniel mentions. Okay, so wholes and fictional characters are, this is what I think it means by courtesy, is by convention. And like a whole, again, like you can think of like a hole, like like the hole in my hand, but like defining that as the empty space, you have to do that by only defining it in terms of my hand not being in the empty space. And so that actually is like, it's a dependent object on something else. So it's not actually, it doesn't have its own sort of existence outside of the way something else is conceived of. Okay, and surely it may be thought that comparison should give us pause, for wholes and fictional characters do not matter. However, were McDaniel to argue this way, and to stress, I do not mean to ascribe this argument to him, then the proper retort is that the relevant difference between us on the one hand and wholes and fictional characters on the other is that we have interests and desires, feel pleasure and pain and so on, and these other things do not. Sherlock Holmes may have some properties and figure in some truths, but it is not literally true that he has interests and desires. That and not difference in degree of being is what accounts for the normative relative differences between us on the one hand and wholes and fictional characters on the other. Things might in principle stand differently if McDaniel were to hold that if we are mere beings by courtesy and so do not have full reality, it is less than fully true that we have interests and desires. But be that as it may, McDaniel rejects the idea of degrees of truth. Right, this is, you might think this is true. I'm not sure I'm actually convinced of this argument. So like you might think, okay, like the whole doesn't actually exist. But the question is, does the ring of my fingers actually exist? Yes, and is the whole like part and parcel of that? Maybe, and then the whole does exist if you think the ring exists, because the ring kind of, it is, by definition, it makes a whole. That's the whole point. And so it's like, maybe the dependency here is wrong. Now, fictional characters also. In the world of Sherlock Holmes clearly feels pain. He likes his heroine. So it's like, pleasure and pain are surely very real for Sherlock Holmes in the fictional world where Sherlock Holmes lives. Now, is it not literally true that he has interests and desires? See, this is the funny thing about literally true. Sherlock Holmes is a literal figure, like literal in the terms of literature. Like that is what this means. So what do you mean? Then the author here needs a different definition of real. They're saying certain things are really real, and the fictional characters aren't by virtue of being fictional. They actually haven't defined that here. They're just harping on the word literal for literally true. Now, you'd need some sort of ontological distinction. They didn't actually make that here. So I'm sure you could make this, but this is actually a lot harder to make than what they said here. They kind of hand-waved at the argument. That's okay. I think everyone gets the idea that like Sherlock Holmes doesn't feel pain, but you have to be careful. Sherlock Holmes does feel pain in the stories. Does Sherlock Holmes not feel pain like in the actual world here? Of course not, but so does dead people don't feel pain in the actual world here too. So it gets a little harder and harder to say, well, how is Sherlock Holmes different from a dead person then? Well, Sherlock Holmes never existed. Well, Sherlock Holmes existed in the book, and someone existed in like history. But again, in history, then you have to define history different from the book. You have to have a different sense of ontology going on. And so the question is, if you are actually saying that what's a courtesy and what isn't, then it gets harder and harder to pin this down actually. Because like, do people in the past feel pain? Well, they don't. Did they feel pain in the past? Sure. Did Sherlock Holmes feel pain in the book? Yes. Then again, what's the difference between the history in reality and history in the book? Again, you can keep running the same argument. A little harder to actually pin this down than the author here has made. I'm actually forgetting exactly what is the link. I want to find out what this is. We are on section 5. Where was that definition of the link? I'll be more specific about this. They don't have a fundamental mode of being. That's what that is. Where is the link? Okay. There's a certain link between, on the one hand, question of metaphysics and the degrees of being, on the other hand, of mattering. Okay, yeah, so it's just the definition of that, like, what matters is what matters in metaphysics. And, yeah. So again, like, the author at first says, look, conventional things do matter, these things by courtesy, that's what they're arguing about here. This is this kind of mattering thing here. Oh no, the things that do matter. Links are cool. Sometimes I do like to soup du jour, but everywhere makes it different. Yes. Uh, yeah. Okay, so it's just like what matters is what metaphysical. Again, if you're talking about what the things are that matter, if it's not us, then you can't make the jump to saying it's us. And then if you're saying, well, what's really real is what is really real, and that matters, you then have to define what's really real, and it's not so easy to do that. In terms of like history versus like links are like that, you know? Yes. Yeah, I like sausage links too. Those are good. The possible fundamentality of normative properties. In the course of discussing practical arguments for our full reality, again, authentic full reality, McDaniel brings up and seemingly endorses an argument focusing on other matters. Valpo says that dead people versus fictional people example was really nice. Why, thank you, Valpo. Appreciate it. What's funny is this was what we were arguing about when we were talking about a film. I was bringing the same sort of issue up. This is a very hard issue. Like in the film case before too, what exactly is it to be fictional in film versus fictional in logic versus fictional in history, or not fictional in history, but real in history? Like what counts as the really real stuff? So, but yeah, something that you know, it crops up. Alright, in the course of discussing practical arguments for our full reality, McDaniel brings up and seemingly endorses an argument focusing on other matters. Suppose a form of reductive naturalism is true, according to which moral properties are identical with non-fundamental properties that can be designated by recognizably non-moral predicates. Since these properties are non-fundamental, our normative vocabulary could very easily have designated other properties without missing a joint in reality. Fundamentally speaking, nothing is really right, wrong, good, or bad, and so on. Once we view morality this way, the importance of morality itself seems greatly diminished. Can our moral practices survive the realization of their fundamental insignificance? Note how this argument again concerns matters related to the link. It concerns a supposed relation between a metaphysical feature, fundamentality or lack thereof, and a normative importance. Yeah, so if you have like some sort of theory, but like it could have happened otherwise, so there's multiply realizable, you can do morals in more than one way, then all of a sudden it stops being fundamental because you can do stuff in more than one way and they're all equally good. Once you can do things that are all equally the same, like of the same like sort of goodness or same level, same like quantity or quality, then you can like slice it up differently, and then it loses a sense of reality once there's multiple versions of the same thing that are equally good but different. The author says, my main reaction to this argument should be unsurprising given what I earlier said. Why should we take the metaphysical fundamentality of a property to be a guide to its normative significance? Normative vocabulary can be used to designate many different properties. Even if some of them, but not all, mark joints in reality, why should that mean it less appropriate to use concepts designating those properties to guide one's actions? Okay, I think they just slid right here. They add some of them, but not all. I think what the quote here says, they're identical with non-fundamental. So they were saying none of them are matter here. So once you can reduce them to things that don't care about them, then like I think the author just slid. They're saying some of the moral things matter, but not all. So I'm not sure this argument already. This may break right here immediately. But let's just keep going. Metaphysical significance does not translate into normative significance. The talk of fundamental insignificance is a bit treacherous. What is assumed is that the properties are not fundamental. Maybe there then is a sense in which they are metaphysically insignificant, but whether they are normatively insignificant is a different matter. Okay, fine, but yeah, I guess like if you're saying like metaphysically insignificant, yes, but that's what we're talking about here. So notice that what McDaniel in effect does in the passage quoted is to lay out a certain kind of problem and propose a solution. The problem, or to be careful, supposed problem, is one that, for example, I've discussed at some length elsewhere, and which Tristram McPherson has labeled the problem of alarming symmetry. Yeah, this is interesting. Alarming symmetry. I think I've mentioned this. I was thinking about this not that long ago. Symmetries are weird. Normative vocabulary can be used to designate many different properties. Just because we label certain properties rights and good does not by itself mean that there is any objective reason to focus on them. Others could equally well have designated other properties right and good while using these expressions for normative and evaluative purposes in the way we do. Even if our right and good designate objective properties, the symmetry may remain, and that can seem worrying. The importance of what is right and what is good can seem diminished. Yeah, like if two different groups of people can split on what's right and good, and they're using the same moral words and all the same stuff, it makes it seem like those words don't matter, because if you are getting different answers with the same sort of inputs, then it looks very problematic. The suggested solution is to appeal to the possibility that our right and good designate fundamental properties. My worry mentioned above concerns this solution. Note that another worry about this solution is that alternative normative expressions might also designate fundamental properties. If so, the alarming symmetry remains. Yeah, I mean, if it's all the way down and symmetrical, then you're like, well, you don't actually have anything, our moral properties aren't actually picking out anything fundamental then. If a solution like McDaniel's is rejected, that only serves to make the alarming symmetry problem more pressing. Okay. Yeah, this is the thing. If everyone has like equally good words or equally good moral things, and they don't have the same they don't agree on what actually is morally good, but everyone can like justify themselves just as well, then yeah, you can't say that anyone has a better reality then. But yeah, I'm trying to think. Well, what's McDaniel trying to make out of this one? So McDaniel wants to reductio this and say, look, but we have some sort of some of them mark the joints in reality. Okay. But again, the author here is claiming, even if they do, how do you know that you got the right ones? And so that's a problem, because it might be symmetric. And so yeah, that's what it was. Okay, that's why I got confused. They were postulating that some of them do, but you don't know which ones they are. And if everyone can symmetrically claim rights to them, then you're not going to actually say that some are more fundamental than the others. Okie dokie. Now I got you. This is making me drink all my water. Existence. Independently of McDaniel's framework, one might raise questions about the normative relevance of existence. Is existence normatively relevant at all? It is, to put it mildly, natural to say yes. If we don't exist, then there is nothing there to matter. Whatever to say about modes and degrees of being and the relevance of such metaphysical questions to evaluate and normative issues, the relevance of being and non-being to such issues seems plain. I don't know. I mean, things may matter that were in the past that don't exist now or don't have real one. I did not watch the film Existence. Sorry, Cinesemiotics. I have not. I've seen ads for it. Okay, noted. However, considering some different ontological views, given which we do not... excuse me, again, some of these sentences are tripping me up. However, consider some different ontological views, given which we do not exist. Maybe a mereological nihilist view is true, and there are no complex objects, but only partless simples. There are no tables, but only simples arranged table-wise. And there are no persons, but only simples arranged person-wise. There is no one object, an I, which performs acts of thinking. Instead, thinking is an activity performed collectively by the simples. Or maybe a radical stage view is true, and there are no persisting objects, but only entities not extended in time. There is no object, an I, which persists and performs acts of thinking. Instead, thinking is relay race, performed by a succession of time slices. Or more radically, a more full-fledged ontological nihilism is true, and there are no objects, not even simples. Instead, the world is perspicuously presented in a pure feature placing language without any reference or quantification. Instead of I am thinking here and now, one should say it is thinking peely teely, where the adverb-like expressions are there in place of expressions referring to locations and times. Yeah, so instead of I think therefore I am, it's something's thinking about now, like here and now. You always got to wonder about, like, this has gotten brought up a lot actually with respect to Descartes. Is it I think therefore I am, or something is thinking therefore it is? It's hard to get away from the I, but you can see how if once you start thinking about that, like you can also start thinking, okay, something is thinking, but like what is the I? You can't guarantee there's a unified I there. You can just say, well, thinking is happening and therefore there is thought. But yeah. The positions just described are all radical positions, but do they have radical normative consequences? Should I care less about myself and loved ones if it turns out that we do not exist, but instead the facts are as stated by one of these ontological theories? I do not know how to argue for one view over another here, but for what it's worth, my own sense is essentially no. Even if these are genuinely different ontological views, the differences in the perspectives on the world which they offer don't matter normatively. Maybe things will need to be put differently depending on which theory is correct, but the differences are without practical significance. What I might have described as my love for a persisting person X would, if I were to become convinced of one of these views, have to be reconfigured in terms of connected successions of simples performing various collective actions, or in terms of a relay of successive X slices, etc. But the love itself would not cease to be rational. When I imagine one of these radical metaphysical views being true, I do not start to feel less normatively significant, nor do I start worrying about the significance of my children, etc. Instead, I rethink the nature of what is significant, where I might have thought that what was significant was some entities and their persistence. I now think that the loci of significance are not entities, but the connections between various episodes, or however one should put things if nihilism is true, given that there are no entities at all, and hence not even such things as episodes or loci for that matter. Normative matters do not depend on the rather abstruse differences between the metaphysical views under consideration. Alright. This was a terrible thing to read. I understand what it said. It was clear enough, but it's a ridiculous paragraph. Yes, it does not... Normative views do not depend on the underlying metaphysics in some, like, absolute crucial way, unless the metaphysics is making it so specific as to matter to them. You can always redefine what matters in whatever metaphysics you want. They're, in some sense, a sort of... or ontological system you want. It's sort of separate. What is valued versus what is an object in your world. You can always sort of you can always put a layer, or you can like put them together in different ways. And so even if you change your metaphysics to be a radical metaphysics where nothing exists in the world, the things that you are doing in that world are still happening. It just happens in that sort of weird existing way. If one of the radical metaphysical views mentioned is true, then my loved ones do not exist and neither do I. But they contrast with other kinds of views given which my loved ones do not exist or are not what I thought them to be. Consider the possibility that my loved ones are robots without consciousness or are mere hallucinations conjured up by my fevered brain. To my mind, these latter scenarios do have a normative relevance that the metaphysical views brought up do not. Properly stating the difference between the two classes of cases would be a delicate matter, but roughly speaking, the difference is that in one class of cases, the normatively relevant stuff, the pleasant and the painful, the satisfying and the frustrating, would still be going on. The difference is being that the views only concern its metaphysical packaging, whereas in the other class of cases, what's normatively relevant is simply missing. Yeah. So if you define yourself out of the thing, then it's just simply missing, but the other part of it is it's just metaphysical packaging. So like if you just package the metaphysics differently, it matters. But if it's simply missing, then like you've defined yourself out of it. But then you've got different problems. Relating back to the distinction between the Parmenidean view and the nihilist view, nihilism in the sense of normative nihilism, mentioned in section 3, I do not see that these metaphysical theories even provide rational reason to accept the Parmenidean view. Whether a more person-centric view is justified or not is to be determined on properly normative grounds and is not determined by metaphysics. What happened What happens to the issues discussed by McDaniel in connection with the link, if existence indeed is unimportant in the way suggested? One may think that these issues immediately go away. If the existence of entities is not needed for normative significance, then clearly the mode of being of entities is not crucial for normative significance either. But someone like McDaniel could in principle argue that they just take on a different form. Consider, say, the mereological nihilist view. Maybe the counterpart within the mereological nihilist setting of the question of whether we are fully real is the question of whether the simples and the relevant relations holding between them are fully real. It is harder to make any sense of McDaniel-esque questions about metaphysical status given a thoroughgoing ontological nihilism, for within that setting there are no entities such that any normative issues hinge on the full reality of those entities. One can still, in principle, distinguish between fundamental and non-fundamental truth, but since there are no entities, the fundamentality of a truth does not in any way relate to their fundamentality or otherwise of entities involved in the truth. The framework McDaniel develops in his book is not focused on this sort of thing. If indeed not even ontological nihilism disrupts our ordinary normative outlook, then McDaniel is wrong to see the mode of our being as central to this outlook. I have, of course, not argued for the truth of this antecedent. All I have emphasized in this last section that there are perspectives on these matters that fundamentally differ from that presupposed by McDaniel. Okay, so what the fuck just happened there? Basically, this person has separated out the normative from the metaphysical or the ontological. If you think something matters, you can always find a way, if you are like ruthless enough, to keep adding in a way to understand things that matter, no matter how radical a world you have. Okay, so if you have like a world where there is nothing, you can still say, well, look, unless there's absolutely nothing, then what are we talking about? If there's anything, then it can talk about how those things are arranged, or how they are moving, or how they're changing over time. And that can say, well, certain kinds of things, when they're moving or organized in this way, that matters, versus if they are not doing it that way. So like, maybe if they if they like some sort of the Parfitian view where there is like some sort of care going on, then it doesn't really matter like how you think of like the underlying objects in the world, but certain things that those objects are apparently organized doing, that is what matters. And that's fine, you can always put that back. And so since you can always separate out and put it back, they're arguing that you can't actually maintain this link between the metaphysics and what matters in the world, because the metaphysics is then arbitrary. The mattering can't actually be directly correlated to what it is to be. Like what it is to be, if you can always switch this out, as long as there is something, you're not going the full nihilism as they were just saying at the bottom. It can always be, you can always recreate the mattering on any different level of ontology, if you are ruthless enough about how you want to define what it is to matter and what the ontology is, as long as you are not going full nihilist where there is absolutely nothing in the universe. So, exactly how ruthless you want to be with your metaphysics is a excellent question. Yeah. What is it to authentically be is an interesting question, but you can't, that's what this problem is with the link. Where are you getting the link? And the idea that you can define that off your metaphysics is, this author is saying, just too idealistic. And so basically, it goes back to the Heidegger. What is being in Heidegger? The Dasein? I mean, basically things all, they are out in the world, and this is what they do is, the joke is, of course, that like the tree trees, the hammer hammers. But what does it do? That is its being, is what it does in some sense. It's a tool-based ontology. Things are as they do. But that's the thing. The metaphysics behind that, there is no greater understanding of being, and Heidegger has been criticized more than once that being is actually completely opaque. you only have the objects of the everyday world, and that being is opaque, and that you can always switch out the metaphysics underneath because there is no being there. And that is actually what this author is hammering McDaniel on, because McDaniel wants to say, well, there are certain things that matter. How does it matter? Well, this caring, what does it do? You're saying, well, that's what matters. That's what people do. We care. That is the function of humans, and that's what matters. But this is the link. You can always sever this link between the metaphysics and what matters, because there is no way to actually pin down a hard link between what matters and the metaphysics. So yeah, that's a mouthful. I know that's a little hard because people are not usually so versed in metaphysics and ontology, and we got some jargon going on here. But yeah, is there any questions about being Brentano style accounts of intrinsic value, where something is good if only there's an act of love that is fitting, and that's what makes something good, that because it's related to an act of love? You feel like the nights when you have to lurk are the nights when you read the best papers. You're gonna have to revisit this one. I mean, I thank you for saying we have some good papers here. Appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, frankly, what I would really like to do is go like skim McDaniel's book one of these days if I don't have time. But yeah, if anyone doesn't know Aristotle, well, yeah, best with respect to your weirdo research interests. Well, this is a lot of fun, this one. You know, this why I think Valpo also mentioned it. Anyone who does not know, go follow Aristotle. He does Ask Him Anything in terms of philosophy, and professor of ethics, ancient Greek philosophy. But yeah, you know, but like, I like the metaphysics, you know, in some sense. When I get myself into one of these areas where I'm explaining stuff that I kind of have a sense about, like the metaphysics, sometimes like the philosophy of logic and language, I mean, I feel like it's better. Of course, I think it's a little bit better content, and so I'm interested in it, I can talk about it, and I do feel like, you know, there's content, but, you know, I can't read this stuff all the time. So I hope like maybe the show is better, like when I can be like, what is it to attend to something, and why is, like I was criticizing up here, I mean, basically there's a idealistic conceit about what it is to attend to and loving, because like that, I mean, there's this object-directed attitude right here. Like, this just falls out of the definition of what most people mean by attending to an object-directedness, and then you can't define anything out of it because it's just a tautology. It's just true by definition. So yeah, so it's like, yeah, I mean, try to get something good out of the philosophy, what we're reading. Yeah. And I always appreciate when everyone talks, Aristotle, Valpo, Semiotics, anyone else who comes by, because, you know, sometimes I can ramble on, I don't get everything right, I make mistakes, so it's nice to have people engaging, but you don't need to, of course. It's just, we discuss the philosophy, try to make some sense of why is this author writing this paper, and the question is, well, clearly the issue here is people think that things matter, and Kris McDaniel has said things matter because, you know, metaphysics matter, and so you can define like what it is to, like, for people to be good and what's valuable in the world. And the problem is you can separate out the metaphysics and the and, you know, what's really funny about that is when Semiotics says, oh yeah, remind everyone that Heidegger's a Nazi, and I said immediately, Heidegger's metaphysics has no moral aspect to it, and this is like exactly in this paper. McDaniel was trying to get a moral normative sense of goodness out of a metaphysics that does not have one. And this author has pointed that out, that you can always, basically, this metaphysical structure, you're not going to get a norm out of it. Like, you're not going to get morals out of it. What matters is not going to be, or at least what people say matters is not going to be given by the metaphysics. In some sense, that is, you know, thinking about it now, the reason why authenticity mattered so much to Heidegger is because that was not what was given by the philosophy. That's kind of what mattered to people, was that's what we did, and that was up to us. And so the idea that you're going to read the authenticity off the metaphysics is wrong, because like that was what Heidegger in some sense thought was up to us. Problem was he was a crap person, and it again maybe needed a little bit more metaphysics there to put a little bit of not do like kill mass murder and stuff and justify genocide. So maybe he could have used with a little bit more moral in his metaphysics, but you're not going to get that out of his metaphysics. It just doesn't exist. I mean, and this is me arguing, I'm not a Heidegger expert. It's that someone literally asked about like ethics in when I was in class, and the teacher, who was a Heidegger expert, said, yeah, no, you're just not going to find it. It's like you can't find it there. It's not going to be there as far as the teacher knew, and it's just like the state of the metaphysics. It's amazing metaphysics, but if you're looking for morals and value, you have to look somewhere else. And so, yeah. Okie dokies.